Imagine a baby wrapped not in swaddling clothes, but in the rough fabric of an altar. No lullabies. No name. No right to life. Thus begins the story of a girl who was never called by her name. She was born amid stone, blood, and silence, in the sacred house of Cybele, the Great Mother. In ancient Rome, the cult of Cybele was one of the most mysterious and cruel. Its priestesses observed ritual purity. The cult itself was closely associated with pain, renunciation of the flesh, and self-sacrifice. Women who served Cybele were not allowed to give birth. Motherhood was considered unclean, but sometimes life broke through even the most strict prohibitions. Children who appeared in temples belonged to no one. They were not registered, not named, not recorded in any list. This girl survived, but in the eyes of the world she did not exist. She was the one who serves, a small shadow in a grand ritual. She was not beaten, but she was not touched gently either. She never knew what a hug was. She was not taught to speak. She was taught to be silent, to observe, to disappear at the right moment. Her body was a tool for purification. Her hands were for washing. Her eyes were for avoiding contact with strangers. It was not a childhood. It was a process of purification, the transformation of flesh into silence. Where there should have been a family, there was a cult. Where there should have been a name, there was a function. Where there should have been an I, there was service. Imagine you are a child. You are taken from a temple, driven through burning Rome, and brought not to a home, but to a palace. But you are not a guest. You are property. It was not salvation. It was a transfer. In ancient Rome, children born into slavery automatically belonged to their master. They could not complain, they could not refuse, they could not escape. They could be exchanged, sold, given as gifts or vows. This is how a girl from the temple of Cybele ended up in the home of the most influential woman in the empire, the empress. She was not asked if she wanted this. She was not asked anything. In Rome, slaves had no voice, literally. A slave could not appear in court and had no personal rights. Their masters gave them names if they gave them any at all. The palace looked like a marble paradise. But for her it was a cage with golden bars. There was no warmth there. Only protocols. Only orders. Only the system. From morning to night she watched the words, the gestures, the pauses between words. In the imperial palace, every glance could be dangerous, and every mistake could be fatal. Even a child understood that. A child whom no one ever touched gently. Who did not know her own face, because there were no mirrors for slaves. Who was silent not because she had nothing to say, but because no one listened. Now imagine that your body is no longer yours. You don't decide when to speak, how to sit, where to look. Even the way you breathe is learned, controlled, punished. In a Roman palace, everything had to be subjugated. Voice, hands, posture, gait. But most of all, the body. Especially a woman's body. And even more so, a slave's. Girls were not beaten. It was inappropriate to beat them. They were molded like clay, like porcelain to be displayed on an altar. Nothing in her body belonged to her. Her hair was a decoration for others. Her skin had to be flawless. Her eyes were always downcast. Her lips were closed. In ancient Rome, girls, especially those who served in the homes of the nobility, underwent systematic obedience training. It was not education, it was social engineering. Imperial tutors taught gestures that meant silence, taught them to listen through doors, taught them to be nobody, so as not to disturb someone. She was not called by name. She was not caressed. She was not touched by hands, only by fabric, water, or a glance. She did not know what her name sounded like because it was never spoken. Her body was cleansed daily, not out of love but out of duty. It was the upbringing of a sacred instrument, because she was no longer a child. She was becoming a vessel. But for what purpose, she had not yet been told. Imagine a child who does not learn to speak. Not because she cannot, but because she is not allowed to. In ancient Rome, silence was the language of subordination. Slaves, especially young ones, had to be quiet, clean, and inconspicuous. In noble households, this meant no questions, no shouting, and no talking without permission. If you are not heard, you are not punished. If you are not seen, you are not a threat. It was not a choice. It was a form of survival. In the empress's palace, a girl was taught the rituals of silence. It was not just silence, it was the complete deactivation of her own self. She was taught how to breathe so that no one could hear her breathing, how to walk so that the sand and floor did not creak, how to hide her gaze so that no one would catch her looking at them. In Roman estates, child slaves were often used as shadow servants for the personal needs of noble women. Their function was to be nearby without attracting attention. Even a glance could be risky, especially if you were a child without a name. She was taught to keep her eyes down. Her hands had to be kept together. Her gait was adjusted to the rhythm of her mistress. Every action had to be part of a presence without presence. She did not laugh. She did not cry out loud. She did not speak to the maids, because all the maids were part of the hierarchy, and even among the slaves there was a structure of subordination. Silence was not just a character trait. It was a survival instinct. That was how she lived. Without words, without permission, without a mirror. A servant who could be overlooked, and yet seen everywhere. It was the year 89 AD. Domitia Longina reigned as empress beside Emperor Domitian. In her marble palace, where every surface gleamed with order, a nameless girl was being shaped into a vessel. In ancient Rome, a slave's body belonged to her master. But in the imperial household it belonged to eyes, expectations, and rituals. Especially if the slave was young. Especially if she was female. Each morning the girl was stripped, washed, and polished like a sacred object. The process was silent, meticulous, and utterly impersonal. Older slave women, nutrisses corporis, examined her skin for marks, parasites, or flaws. They scrubbed her with rough brushes, poured warm water over her back, rubbed her with perfumed oils. Not out of care. Out of duty. Her body had to be flawless, not for herself, but for the reputation of the household. Cosmetics were applied with calculated restraint. Her eyes were lined, but not seductively. Her lips were moistened, not smiling. Her hair was oiled and arranged in obedient symmetry. There was no room for expression, only precision. She was a surface to be controlled. Roman sources mention that young female slaves were trained in the art of disappearance. They were taught how to walk without creaking floorboards, how to breathe without sound, how to move as shadows. Her posture had to suggest elegance, but never identity. Her face neutrality. Some girls failed. There was one, a quiet girl new to the palace. Her steps were too fast. Her breathing too loud. She once smiled when no one else did. One evening, without warning, she was taken. No screaming. No explanation. Just absence. The next morning, the washing room was colder. The other girls stood straighter. No one asked where she had gone. A reddish stain on the floor was scrubbed until it vanished. Disappearance in that world was not a tragedy. It was a function. Like silence. Like obedience. After that day, the girl, the one who still remained, stopped looking at her reflection in the polished bronze basin. She no longer wondered who she was, only how not to be noticed. Her body was no longer her own. Her name had never existed. All that remained was the ritual of cleansing, dressing, erasing, repeated until even memory surrendered. Now imagine that you are stripped naked every day, not for humiliation, but for the sake of order. That your body is not intimate but a duty. That your nakedness is not an act of trust but a ritual. In the Roman Empire, washing and cleansing the body were part of daily discipline, especially in high-ranking households. For slaves, it was not an act of care. It was a procedure that confirmed the master's power over every part of the body. This girl was washed every day. Without words, without choice, without tenderness. Her body was like an object. It had to be cleansed, washed, wrapped, and displayed. Every part of her, from her hair to her heels, had to be ready for viewing. Slaves in Rome were washed by older female servants or special body assistants, nutrices corporis. This was not just a hygienic act, it was an act of submission. She was placed over a marble trough, doused with warm water and scrubbed with brushes. Not cruelly, but ruthlessly ritualistic. Sometimes in silence. Sometimes with comments. The body was analyzed for spots, scratches, bruises, and hair where it shouldn't be. Hair was removed. Nails were cleaned. The skin was rubbed with oils. This was not grooming. It was preparation for service in the palace. Roman sources mention ceremoniae purgationis, purification before rituals or before appearing before noble persons. This applied not only to matrons, but also to their closest servants. The girl did not understand why she was examined every day, as if she were a chest of drawers. But she learned not to cringe when people looked at her. Not to avert her gaze. Not to hide her body. Not to cry. Her body was no longer her home. It was a space that others could use. And it had to be presentable, according to someone else's rules. In Roman culture, female slaves had no concept of personal boundaries. The idea of bodily autonomy is a modern concept. Back then, it simply did not exist. Imagine you are a child. You are locked up for the night with others in a room with no windows, no candles, and no right to leave. Not for any fault of your own, but for order, for safety, for control. In wealthy Roman homes, especially in imperial palaces, locking slaves up at night was common practice. This was not only to prevent escape. It was a way to maintain discipline, hierarchy, and, most importantly, fear. The palace had a rhythm, and the rhythm had rules. One of them was that after sunset, slaves were locked in the inner rooms, often without light, without personal space. They didn't even have the right to ask to go outside. Female slaves who served in the inner chambers were often locked up not in separate rooms, but in shared enclosed spaces, storerooms, cloakrooms, and utility rooms. They weren't allowed to leave the premises without permission, even at night. This girl was locked up with others. In the corner was an older slave woman with a lamp. Near the door was a clay pot instead of a toilet. In the room there was only breathing bodies, whispers, and silence. There are Roman documents that mention special cubiculum servorum, night rooms for slaves. But in palaces, even service corridors or storerooms were often used. She did not ask why she could not sleep with the door open. She didn't ask why the doors were locked with a metal bolt. She already knew. Slaves had no night to themselves. There was only a pause between orders. Slaves had no concept of privacy. Even sleep was not a vacation but part of their service. They had to be ready to wake up at any moment. Sometimes someone cried, but quietly, because even in a locked room, silence was enforced. Everyone knew that if the door opened again at night, it was a bad sign. Behind the door was a palace, and here was a waiting room, without dreams, without hope, without windows. Now imagine, you are always nearby but no one has the right to look at you. You hear conversations, see faces, observe, but it is as if you do not exist. No one greets you, asks you anything, or calls you. You are a presence without recognition. In luxurious villas and imperial palaces, domestic service was carefully organized. Slave companions, mostly women, had to be always nearby but never get in the way. They were called invisible. This girl did not sit. She did not rest. She stood aside by the door near the curtain behind a column. Standing motionless was part of her training. Being a shadow was a rule of survival. Roman matrons had slaves for every function. dressing, carrying a mirror, holding a chest, bringing a chair. But these servants were not allowed to speak first. They were not allowed to look anyone in the eye. They were not allowed to show fatigue. She held things that never belonged to her. She carried a vase she could not break. She accompanied a lady who never asked her name. Slaves were considered household items. In some legal texts, they were described along with furniture and equipment. They were functional bodies, not personalities. No one looked her in the eye. But everyone noticed if she stepped too loudly. No one thanked her. But every mistake was punished. Her body had a function. Her hands silence. Her presence disappearance. This invisibility had psychological consequences. Slaves lost their sense of themselves as separate beings. Many of them stopped speaking over the years even when they could. This girl was still alive. But the world around her was already teaching her how to disappear properly. Imagine. Your job is to carry a mirror. But you must not look into it. You must hold a comb but never touch your own hair. To be close to a woman's body, but have no rights to your own. In Rome, the body of a matron, a woman of noble birth, was an important part of her status. It had to be well-groomed, clean, adorned, and it was the slaves who were responsible for this aesthetics. They were not just servants. They became an extension of their mistress's body. This girl served a different body every day. She washed it. She oiled it. She trimmed her nails. She wiped away sweat. And always from below, with her eyes cast down to the floor. Sources mention that some female slaves were specially trained in massage, cosmetics, and skincare. They were used as living tools, literally performing their mistress's daily rituals with their hands. She was not allowed to touch herself. All her movements were outward. Her hands always belonged to someone else. In a Roman home, it was an honor to have a servant who could do hair, paint eyelashes, or rub fragrances into the skin. But this honor did not extend to the slave herself. Her body remained unadorned. How does a child feel when she rubs someone else's skin every day, but never feels the touch of her own with tenderness? What happens to your psyche when your body is just a tool for someone else's pleasure, comfort, or status? Slaves had no personal physicality. They were not subjects of care, only objects of labor. This girl learned not to think about her own body. It was a source of effort, but not of attention. A means of care, but not an object of care. This is how obedience was formed. This is how identity was erased. This is how the body became a shadow. Now think about this. You live among people, but no one notices when you disappear. No one asks where you went. And worst of all, no one is surprised. Because your disappearance is part of the order. In ancient Rome, slaves were property, not people. They could change owners, disappear from their homes, fall into debt, become gifts, be punished or killed, without any legal record of the loss of their personality. No one counted this girl. Her name was not recorded. Her birth was not registered. Her existence was conditional. Legally, children born into slavery were automatically considered the property of their mother's owner. They were not included in family trees. They were not included in censuses as persons. They had no right to inheritance, marriage, or protection. She disappeared just as she had appeared, silently. Her belongings were not cleared away because she had none. Her rooms were not empty because she slept on the floor with the others. No one spoke of her. No one looked for her. No one remembered her. In large households, the disappearance of a slave could be explained as a transfer, punishment, relocation, or even left unexplained. Slaves had no right to inquire about the fate of other slaves. None of the female slaves dared to look up and ask, "Where is she?" Because that could have called into question the main rule. A slave is a function. If she disappears, she will simply be replaced. This girl once carried water. Then she didn't. She once held up a mirror. Then she didn't. Once she was a shadow. Then she became emptiness. And it was in this silence of disappearance that the greatest horror lay. Nothing had changed. Because a slave who disappears leaves no trace. Neither in the house, nor in memory, nor in history. Imagine that you were never called by your name. Never. Not because you were forgotten, but because no one thought it necessary to know. And when you disappeared, there was nothing left that could be called a loss. In Rome, a name was not just a form of address. It was a legal status, a sign of citizenship, of family affiliation. A citizen had 3 names, praenomen, nomen, cognomen. A freedman had 2. A slave had none. Or just a nickname. This girl had no name. She was never recorded in the census. She was not included in inventory lists because she was temporary. She was simply called you. Many slaves were given nicknames such as Felix, Cyrus, or Niger. Not based on their character, but for convenience. But even that was not always the case. Especially if the child was the daughter of a slave and was expected to be a temporary resource. When she disappeared, no one remembered her. Because to remember is to name, and to name is to acknowledge existence. For a Roman of noble birth, a slave was a thing that speaks. If this thing disappeared, it was not death. It was the loss of a thing, like a broken vase. This is true disappearance. Not physical but semantic. When you were not on the map of the world because you were not on the map of words. And there were tens of thousands of such slave children in Rome. They left no graves. They left no letters. They had no genealogy. History remembers them as emptiness. This girl disappeared. Not because she died, but because she was never someone in the eyes of others. Now think about it. How many stories do we lose because they never had a name?